Yes, and apologies, I don't have my mic, so I hope the sound quality is okay. Frank, am I coming through? Yep, great.
Yes. Yep.
Fantastic. Okay, welcome everybody to our inaugural Unsettling Knowledge Seminar for this calendar year, not this academic year, this calendar year. And welcome on behalf of the Decolonization Research Group, which is based at Utrecht University, although it is Netherlands and indeed Low Countries wide. And that's one of our primary objectives this year. So first, I will quickly remind everybody of our mission, which is to explore both the processes of decolonization and the theories and concepts of decoloniality, to amplify the voices of women and scholars who've been traditionally marginalized from the academy and topics that have been marginalized from the academy, and to provide a place of solidarity and sharing for our research and for our decolonial communities. So those are our three kind of overarching aims and principles. And this year in particular, we would like to focus on our Netherlands networks, on our Dutch networks, on our Belgian networks, and really see who's doing what and create, hopefully, now that COVID is hopefully subsiding a bit, or that we're treating it as an endemic condition rather than a pandemic crisis, hopefully we can gather in person and enjoy that third part of our mission, the solidarity and space to be together as scholars working on decolonization, decoloniality, together in a Dutch and Low Countries network. So look at our agenda, sign up to our newsletter. We will end with a reminder at the end of our inaugural, well, not inaugural, our first annual general meeting of the group for this year, which is coming up. Hannah will remind us of the date of that at the end, and our next seminar. We also have our diversity reading list launch coming up, and a really exciting workshop on Anton de Kom and his global anti-colonial connections, which we are hosting with the Housinger Center on the occasion of the publication of the translation of his work into English. That was a long sentence. I am now going to invite Frank to introduce Larissa, and thank you for being with us today.
Right, great, thank you. So welcome everybody in our first talk of this series, a series in which we try to think about ways in which we can unsettle different academic disciplines, different approaches to knowledge, and maybe even decolonize that knowledge at some stages. That's what we try to reflect on. Our program is already online. Each month we have a distinguished speaker. Over the moon to say that we today have Larissa Schulte Nordholt, who is a fresh PhD, PhD holder, a doctor in history. She defended her PhD in December of last year, so a month or two ago, if I'm not mistaken. And she seems to have been preparing for her PhD ever since she graduated with a BA in history at Leiden University, where she graduated cum laude at Leiden University with a BA in history. Worked or studied abroad for a semester at Rutgers University in New Jersey. Did a MPhil in political thought at the University of Cambridge, and then won a Prix de Paris, which allowed her to spend a year in the UNESCO archives to prepare for her PhD, which dealt with an incredibly interesting topic, which we're going to hear more about today. The title of her PhD is Africanizing African History, Decolonization of Knowledge in UNESCO's General History of Africa.
Coming to the next point, and that's the analysis of narratives. Because if I'm talking about narrative analysis, where the narrative is the end point of research. So
whoever has accidentally joined our session while in the middle of another one, could you please adjust that situation?
it's good to see that people are everybody's invested in trying to deconstruct what it is that we think we are studying. The last thing I wanted to say before we got interrupted, though, is two things. One, Larissa already has an impressive publication list, which you can find on our profile, since she is a lecturer now at Leiden University, and you can have access to her PhD, which is open access, because she did her PhD under an NWO, a prestigious NWO scholarship, which requires her to have the PhD open access, which is great for us and for our knowledge sharing. So I would urge you to Google her, go to her webpage on Leiden University and access the PhD dissertation. Larissa, if you are ready, I'm excited to hear what you have to say.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I think it is a great thing that it is open access, because it's accessible to people around the world that way. I think that's an important thing. So I'll not introduce myself any further, because I think that that has been covered. What I want to do today is elaborate on my dissertation topic. So the talk, I imagine, will elaborate on the history of decolonizing or Africanizing African history. These are terms that I use interchangeably because my sources use them interchangeably. But I would say that Africanizing history has more to do with the actual people who write the history, and decolonizing is more about the structure of knowledge. In particular, the talk today will focus on the general history of Africa, a post-colonial, anti-colonial, post-independence history of Africa, multi-authored, bilingual, UNESCO-sponsored, the general history of Africa, or l'histoire générale de l'Afrique, an 8-volume series of African history. It was the first big work of African historiography that really aimed to bring together knowledge about the entire continent, including also the parts of North Africa. And so today I want to highlight how historians working on that project sought to Africanize and decolonize the writing of African history, specifically in the wake of political independence, the political independence of many West and East African countries in the early 1960s. I want to argue that although these historians did not engage in any kind of decolonization in language that we can now recognize as post-colonial or maybe even decolonial, that it nevertheless is important to look at their history, because they are part of the history of trying to move away from Euro-American ways of thinking, Euro-American frameworks in historiography. And so I want to stress that our current calls for decolonization, the current project that this seminar series is a part of, has a history itself, and that we need to think more deeply perhaps about that history. In my talk, I want to conclude that decolonizing history, or decolonization itself, takes place on different levels, epistemic, of course, but also economic, financial, maybe even political. And so I argue that that post-colonial critique on the conceptual nature of academic history writing and the history of knowledge production about Africa, what Valentin Mudimba has called the colonial library, very aptly, needs to be brought into conversation a bit more, perhaps, with studies of scholarly practice, to show that criticism of a conceptual nature perhaps has its limits. I want to say that there is more at play hindering the development of autonomous academic knowledge than epistemic barriers thrown up by a coloniality of knowledge. It was unfeasible in the end for the UNESCO General History of Africa to decolonize the writing of history, because of epistemic barriers, but also because of a lack of substantial political as well as financial support. And I have forgotten to ask whether everyone can see my PowerPoint. Yes, great. And can everyone now see this second slide of my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Fantastic, thank you. So this is what I want to talk about today. I first want to introduce the work itself a bit more. And I then want to illustrate what the ideals of decolonizing knowledge were within the general history of Africa, And then I want to come up with some examples of what that looked like in practice and in how far ideals could actually be translated into a practice of decolonization. And of course, lastly, I'll offer some concluding remarks. So the General History of Africa first came into being in 1962, actually. It was launched formally by UNESCO in 1964, but it was first discussed in 1962 at the first International Congress of Africanists organized in Accra in Ghana. And this was a time when African history as an academic discipline, written by Africans rather than just Euro-Americans, had just started to come into its own. So one of the attendees of this very first Congress in Africa was the Kenyan historian and specialist in the collecting Luo oral traditions, which was one of the newly developed methodologies of African history, which tried to defy European ideas of what it meant to create historical knowledge. One of these attendees was Bethwell Allen Ogot. And in his autobiography, he writes about the general history, and he writes about this Congress in 1962 as a monumental occurrence. It was during this Congress that he locates the birth of the general history of Africa, and that he connects it very strongly to Kwame Nkrumah. And he becomes an important figure in Ogot's narrative about the general history. Ogot describes how Nkrumah had invited 12 historians, African historians, back to Flagstaff House, his official residence, to discuss the creation of a general Pan-African history of the continent. And he also says that the number 12 was meaningful because Nkrumah, who was raised a Catholic, of course, compared the 12 historians to the 12 disciples of Jesus Christ, right? Casting himself in the role of a sort of Pan-Africanist Christ. And Ogot then embellishes the story even more by calling himself and the other 11 the African cultural activists who were going to create an African history. And so this story is just meant to illustrate what this project meant to Ogot and what it meant maybe in that time in the early 1960s. Right? The meeting took all night. He describes how they spoke about maybe a United States of Africa even. But what it makes clear is, I think, that the historical initiative was important because history was not just history. It had the capability of shaping a political future. It was a political tool. And so the meeting shows how much was at stake for African historians during the period of political decolonization. So in 1964, the project finally actually gets launched at the UNESCO's 13th General Conference. And this marks the beginning of a more than 30-year project of writing African history, of writing Africa-centered African history of the African continent, a 30-year history of collaboration between more than 300 different authors, 8 volumes, writing the history of the continent from prehistory until the end of the 20th century, until about 1975. And like the Congress of its birth, the General History of Africa aimed to bridge Cold War divides in knowledge production. So it strove to be a revisionist history of the African continent that would include North Africa, as I've already mentioned. It was also, the General History of Africa was also determined to include as many authors as possible from all corners of the continent, including also the diaspora. And it was led specifically from 1971 onwards by a so-called International Scientific Committee for the Drafting of a General History of Africa, which is quite a mouthful. So I will call it the ISC from now on. Which consisted of 39 members. The first volume was finally published in 1980 in French, and the last volume was published in 1998, also in French, and English volumes appeared in between those two dates. So it was a multilingual, collaborative, non-aligned project, or that was the ideal anyway. Multilingual, meaning it was produced in different languages. We here see a picture of the 8 volumes in Portuguese. You can see how thick they are also. They're about 800 to 1,000 pages each. So they do really contain a wealth of knowledge about the African continent. And it's been one of the first places where that knowledge was combined in one relatively easy to acquire set of books. Other languages that it was translated into are French and English, of course, but also Arabic. There are shortened versions in Chinese, in Swahili, and in some other African languages. And so you can tell that the series really aimed to reach a lot of people as well. So in my thesis, I have taken the general history of Africa as a case study to investigate what it meant to Africanize African history. And I show how an imagined Pan-African decolonization of African historiography was brought into practice in the decades during and after the African independences in the 20th century. And I also try to show what political, intellectual, academic, practical, ideological difficulties the historians working on this project encountered in the process. And the ambition to write a general history of Africa was motivated, of course, by the Euro-American denial of the existence of African historicity from the 19th century onwards. And so that meant that its intent was very much to prove that Africa had a history towards a discipline and a continent that had long denied this fact. But in doing so, the historians involved in the project were caught in a paradoxical translation of the historical difference between their societies and Euro-American projections of modernity on those societies. And this was all part of the African effort to negotiate inclusion in the post-colonial world order. So it was part of the process of decolonization. And I argue, along what Adam Getachew has argued, that they needed this Pan-African frame in order for national identities and national nation-state building to be effective. It was a sort of protective outer layer almost. Because the general history of Africa aimed to move away from the European continent, I do think it merits that I spent some time reflecting on my own position, our location, from which I am working, from which most of us, I imagine, are working within this talk. I think it's an important part of this seminar series to reflect on this. If we see Europe as a continent that is subject to analysis, which takes into account racialization and colonialism, if, in other words, Europe can be decolonized or de-imperialized, it is important to reflect on it in a work of scholarship that studies the Africanization of African history. I am, of course, also a white European author without obvious ties to the history I research, but I am situated at an institution with historic ties to the very colonial knowledge that the general history of Africa tried to critique. So in a way, I'm part of the problem that the general history did very much wish to address. So I think it is important to be aware of that entanglement when we think about these questions, when we think about the question of what national history is and who gets to be part of it, our own national history as well, and how that process of emancipation from certain narratives takes place. Such questions, of course, speak to me because I've wondered such things myself, as part of my own process of emancipation within, feminist emancipation within academia. And so I think it is important to say that this study of the general history of Africa, partly by virtue of my positionality, is also about Europe and about knowledge creation within Europe, as well as it is about African decolonization. And so this entangled history and the fact that the general history did react very much to Euro-American ideas of knowledge is part of the question of why it was difficult to decolonize history. Lastly, and then I will move on to the actual ideals. Although the general history was praised for representing an authentic African historiography, it was also critiqued quite heavily from the 70s onwards for not really moving beyond conceptualizations, methodologies. It's so ardently critiqued as racist and colonialist, right? It was the object of a lot of post-colonial criticism. But I do think that this does not mean that the project does not merit further analysis in terms of its historical moment. Not because the general history really aimed at profound epistemic change, but because the project of Africanization was not entirely successful on its own terms either, and post-colonial critique in a way concurrently emerged as a result of newly arisen problems from the 70s onwards. And so I show that an earlier generation tried to recenter knowledge production about Africa in the continent itself, and that post-colonial critics in a way responded to that failure. The coloniality of knowledge that post-colonial critics sought to unearth could not have become visible without previous studies of non-European areas and histories. So I think it is pertinent to ask how ideals of African history, whilst being mindful of the fact that ideals are always, per definition, different from realities, were formulated in the wake of political independence during a moment of tremendous optimism. Right, so I'll now move on to the ideals before I move on to some of the practices and some examples of why it was difficult to Africanize African history. So the General History of Africa had three foundational ideals that they thought were conducive to the creation of African history as both a scholarly, reputable activity that could take its place amongst other disciplines of knowledge creation in the academy, as well as something that would be conducive to the political emancipation of Africa through the writing of history. And so these three ideals are the ideal of anti-Eurocentrism, right, very much in reaction to what had been written about Africa before, the idea of Pan-African collectivity, specifically in the different authors that would write the books, and lastly, the ideal of emancipation or maybe even nation building. So in response to Eurocentrism, sorry, I need to go to the next slide. Right, so in response to modern Eurocentrism, General History of Africa ideals of knowledge creation were often conceptualized in response to, so as anti-ideals, mistakes, and undesirable convictions or attitudes to avoid, scholarly vices, in other words. The General History never completely rejected scholarship as it had been developed in Europe, but it wished to amend it and add new repertoires of scholarship so as to expunge the existing Eurocentric model when it came to the writing of African history. But it didn't want to expunge all Euro-American developed methodology. So the subject matter and how this would be done played an important role. Right, so the General History of Africa was reacting very much to the idea that Africa had no history, or that the only history worth studying was that of Europeans in Africa, was colonial history, in other words. And so the pre-colonial became an important way to get, or an important subject to get away from Eurocentric prejudice. In a way, it became a sort of ideological recourse to place opposite the ideological space of colonialist history. And this was the case even though the word pre-colonial, of course, emphasizes the change brought about by the colonizers. But it was very attractive to study a part of history that hadn't been tainted almost by European presence. It was during the first few meetings of the General History of Africa in 1966 in Abidjan, 1969 in Paris, 1970 in Addis Ababa, and in Paris again in 1971, that the committee, the 39-member committee that I mentioned, wrote down some overarching ideals and goals that were to guide the work during its drafting, were to guide authors during the drafting of the chapters. And the same 4 points returned again and again. And I have outlined 2 of them here, or parts of 2, because there's 2 things that I want to highlight. So this document starts with an admonishment, right? So it says, although aiming at a synthesis at the highest possible scientific level, scientific here meaning something similar to the Dutch word wetenschap or the German word Wissenschaft, so encompassing all forms of academic knowledge creation, the history will not seek to be exhaustive and will avoid dogmatism. In many respects, it will be a statement of problems showing the present state of knowledge and the main trends in research, and it will not hesitate to show divergences of doctrine and opinion. In this way, it will prepare the ground for future work. So the desire or the aim to avoid dogmatism, it could be seen as the aim to avoid a classic epistemological vice. Simultaneously, note how it is paired with the need to show divergencies of doctrine and opinion, right? So dogmatism is here constructed as, and elsewhere as well, as a failure to admit insufficiencies in research connected to bias and prejudice, and therefore it is constructed as another word for Eurocentrism also. Note how in the second point that I've highlighted here, it starts with the history will be viewed essentially from the inside, meaning from an African perspective. Although a scholarly work, it will also be in large measure evidence of consideration by African authors of their own civilization, right? So not Europeans writing about Africa, but Africans writing about their own civilization. And so within the general history of Africa, dogmatism is created as a sort of vice pertaining to Eurocentrism, pertaining to bias and racism. It is suggested that racism, Eurocentrism is an epistemological vice, comes from bad, shoddy scholarship, and that the general history of Africa will now right that wrong in a certain way. Of course, these anti-ideals were also turned into a positive program as well. To move on to the second ideal, the general history of Africa aimed to counteract Eurocentric dogmatism with an ideal of writing African history from a continental perspective, meaning collaboratively by as many different African historians as possible, from as many different countries as possible. And this had epistemic as well as political reasons. The epistemic rationale pertains to the idea that different African perspectives will allow for a more complete, a more objective, a non-dogmatic image of the African past. And the political rationale pertained to the idea that it would allow different African historians from around the continent and in the diaspora to develop their careers, to become celebrated, respected historians of the continent. So the idea was also that through the inclusion of many different African voices, the general history could contribute to political emancipation of those historians and their countries. And so they wanted to create space for African historians to write African history. They paid their authors quite a good sum of money. So in practice, the ideal of Pan-African collectivity was expressed through collaborative work efforts, through African diversity in terms of authors and historians who would work on the project. And from the beginning, it was therefore stipulated that it needed to be written and edited by a very diverse collection of authors and editors. And the first step towards this ideal was the 39-member committee, which also had members hailing from different countries in Africa. But the documents, the 1970 document also stated that there was room for persons who evince a deep sympathy for Africa and its problems, suggesting that not all authors had to be African, and indeed they weren't. There were quite a few Euro-Americans contributing to this project as well, for both practical as well as ideological reasons. And on the very same page, it also states that authors had to be politically neutral, which is part of the UNESCO embedding of this project. But it's also meaningful because the project very much aimed to stay respectable within the Cold War world order, right? It wanted to be non-aligned. Now, despite all these aims, most of the authors in the end, or most of the active authors, most of the committee members who did the brunt of the work, came from West and East African countries. And these were all countries that had become independent around the year 1960, around the year of Africa, and so around the year that the general history of Africa came into being as well. So they were very much engaged in the parallel project of nation building and history writing. And I want to show a document from the UNESCO archives here to illustrate what it meant to find authors from different countries. So this is a note written by Maurice Glele, who was the UNESCO secretary for the project and a historian also in his own right. He kept meticulous track of what he called the geographical spread of the authors contributing to the general history. He tracked how many authors came from Africa and from what parts of Africa and from what country, and he commented on whether or not too many Europeans were contributing, too many Americans, white Americans, in order to ascertain whether various regions of Africa were sufficiently represented within the general history of Africa. And you can see here on this note a lot of Tunisia, a lot of Francophone African countries, and not that many Europeans, in fact, only 2 for Volume 4. This is only part of Volume 4, but still, it does give you an interesting idea of how this, keeping track of the geographical spread actually worked. So anyway, this idea of including as many different perspectives as possible was supposed to counteract the vice of dogmatism. And it would make it possible to self-create African history rather than have it defined by outsiders. Lastly, to move on to the last ideal, as I think has become clear by now, the general history of Africa strived to contribute to political emancipation on the continent. And it did so in 2 ways. First of all, it tried to marshal the ideal of, or the practice of oral historiography as a tool which could be used specifically for nation state building through education and heritage conservation. So oral historiography didn't just function as a methodology or genre of source material that could be deployed in the argument against Eurocentrism epistemically, but it was through education and heritage conservation also seen as a carrier of political ideology, right? But this idea of a sort of that oral historiography would somehow reach a sort of pure, unspoiled African past, was at least partly, or maybe for a large part, a utopia connected to this ideal of creating a past of great value for nation-state building. So it's a double-edged sword, I would argue. Secondly, the nationalist, emancipatory, and anti-colonial role the general history of Africa set out to fulfill expressed itself in the wish to spread knowledge widely. So the general history was set to encompass the whole of Africa, not just in terms of topic or authors, but also in terms of its reach. And nationalism had provoked a demand for history books. And as a result, in the early 1960s, funding was readily available for universities and historians to write these history books. And so these early years of nationalism, of nation-state building, overlap with the most productive years of the new discipline as well. In a document from 1966 from Abidjan, it was stated that results of this research should be used for teaching purposes. Cooperation should be organized to that end between specialists in history and specialists in education, preferably in Africa. And so besides paperback editions, the document also introduced a plan to create abridged editions, which were created in the end and which many historians of Africa nowadays tell me are not very good in terms of what they contain. But certainly the general history of Africa aimed to become much more than just an academic work of scholarship. It wanted to be everything. And there's a certain tension in that, of course, between different audiences that the book aimed to reach. At some point, they even spoke about creating a series of comic books based on the work that they had done, with an illiterate audience in mind. So these 3 ideals were entangled and intertwined, mutually influenced one another. All ideals were congruent to both political and academic goals in some way. But the main point was to change the order of knowledge about Africa and the power structure about how knowledge was created. And I now want to spend some time to highlight some examples of what this looked like in practice, and perhaps also explain why the grand ideals or dreams of the general history of Africa weren't always carried out, weren't always brought into fruition in the end. So first I want to focus for a little bit on the crisis in the African Academy, the dwindling of funding from the beginning of the 1970s onwards. And then I want to spend some time talking about the presence of Euro-Americans within this project, which, even though many were invited to join, did create some problems. So first of all, the crisis in the African Academy. Like I said, the early years of the general history of Africa had coincided with a period of tremendous optimism, the so-called golden era or golden years. It had seemed like Africanization of universities in Africa and African control of knowledge produced about Africa was possible. For a brief moment, even during the 1960s, African universities seemed to be able to function as epicenters of global intellectual life. And problems that have since arisen in the Academy for African academics were not always as considerable as they have become in the 21st century, in terms of visa requirements, for instance. From the 1970s onwards, however, funding for universities in Africa dwindled as a result of worldwide financial crises, African political crises, and disillusionment on the continent. And unfortunately for this story, the decline of funding for African studies in Africa went hand in hand with its orientation shifting from the African to the American continent as a result of the injection of many American dollars into African studies centers there. The general history of Africa, meanwhile, struggled to grow used to these changing demands of the time. The emphasis on Pan-African collectivity and collaborative work ethic as a guiding ideal was deemed so important and so crucial for an Africa-centered writing of African history that the goal to complete the work in time was sacrificed for it. Originally, the last volume was supposed to be published in 1978. But as we know now, it only appeared in 1998. UNESCO had functioned, moreover, as a facilitator from the start of the project, but the responsibilities conferred upon the agency increased throughout the 1970s and 80s, while simultaneously the working conditions of the African historians working on the general history deteriorated. They became busier and busier. And so the intellectual and institutional momentum of the 1960s gradually disappeared. Nevertheless, the general history of Africa persisted to adhere to their collaborative work ethic, and it was partly due to that some of the financial difficulties became really pressing. The project dealt with a lack of engagement from the majority of the ISC members, an excruciatingly slow pace of work throughout most of its existence. One basic expectation for members of the committee was that they would show up to their meetings and that they would engage with the work in between sessions as well. But these meetings were organized all over the African continent and all over Europe as well. Some meetings took place in Paris, but some also took place in Sweden and Poland. And so you can imagine what a demand on one's time it was to attend all the meetings. Historians who were part of it were, moreover, required to provide the editors of the volumes. Each volume had a different editor with names of authors, and they were supposed to respond to critique to all the chapters. You can imagine that if you have a book of 800 pages with 30 chapters and 39 people spread across 4 continents have to respond to every chapter and critique every chapter, that will take a while. It was a collaborative work ethic, but it caused delay and delay and delay after delay. So delays became the main problem for the general history, but nevertheless, the people in charge still stuck to this idea that work had to be collaborative in order for it to be worthwhile. Some authors or some ISC members tried to change this way of working, but to no avail. So the collaborative aspect of the general history was both an asset as well as a liability. So solidarity was important, an open attitude geared towards the sharing of knowledge, all important ideals that were very difficult to stick to in practice, especially in a time when we do not have the internet yet, of course. So the practice or the ideal of Pan-African collectivity was translated into a practice of circular letters and endless consultations. The question, of course, remains why the General History of Africa clung to their costly ideals of Pan-Africanism rather than changing its way of working. Part of the answer lies in UNESCO's wish to hold on to dreams of one worldism and universality when they had slowly begun to lose appeal elsewhere in the academy, and despite ardent critique. It was UNESCO's commitment, or rather the commitment of some key players within UNESCO, such as Maurice Gallela, but also the Director General, that made sure that the project was eventually brought into fruition, even if it was years later. Something else that the General History did create, however, and which I think is important to note, is that it did create a space for people to come together, for African historians to talk to each other and to come together even after a lot of funding in their respective universities had dwindled. In his 1994 autobiography, the Belgian historian, an ISC member, Jan van Sina, made a point about the value of UNESCO within the general history and within African historiography. Jan van Sina was a very important member of the General History of Africa. He was, I would say, he was one of the people who made sure it did eventually get published. He was crucial to the completion of the work. And he wrote the following: "The situation regarding the decline of African studies on the continent would have been worse were it not for UNESCO and especially the General History of Africa project. Not only were African scholars such as Jacob Ajayi, Adi Bohen, Bethel Ogot, and Joseph Kizerbo leading figures in the activities, and not only did meetings of the committee or its bureau provide regular occasions for such leaders to meet and confer, but the project spawned the realization of smaller projects. The UNESCO project has therefore been a major catalyst in the historiography of the field." And this is quite a statement from someone who was such an important figure in the field himself. And it is true that the General History of Africa did, besides publishing the 8 volumes, also published 12 smaller books in which conference papers and reports of meetings were readily available for everyone who wanted them. So this is also a great source to look at, by the way, for everyone who's interested in this, because it is not something I was able to look at in detail for my PhD just yet. My last point that I want to discuss today, the presence of Euro-Americans within this project and how that created a sort of tension. As I've already mentioned, I think it's very important, particularly for this seminar. Euro-American historians within the general history, of course, had a very different experience from the African leaders that van Sina mentioned. And the presence of Euro-American historians, I think, has remained somewhat problematic ever since the inception of African history as a discipline studied in the academy, in the Euro-American Academy. There's an imbalance and continuing imbalance regarding the study of Africa as situated more within North America and Europe rather than on the continent itself, or at least we don't seem to talk to each other as much as the general historians of Africa did, if I may call them that. So the general history is itself an interesting case because it is a relatively successful story of focus on African history as written by Africans. But it nevertheless stumbled upon some problems of Euro-American epistemic dominance. And although the presence of Euro-Americans has been welcomed from the very beginning, throughout the project, complaints started to come in about the predominance of non-Africans within the project. A prevailing concern from African historians and also from some Euro-Americans, paradoxically, was that there were too many of them, and that could endanger the project's original goals and ideals. Mostly, these issues pertain to, on the one hand, Cold War politics, and on the other hand, material divergencies. So the Cold War interfered with Africa's ability to center knowledge production on Africa because it tended to force African academics to take a side in the global conflict. It was difficult to create an African-centered history of Africa, so long as one part of the bipolar world order, mostly Americans in this case, was shouting in your ear about the way they viewed the world. It was hard to rid the general history of Africa of discussions and differences of opinion that African historians felt were not strictly epistemic or related to African political realities, but were actually related to Cold War questions and politics. This was the case especially because the general history was part of UNESCO and the United Nations, and therefore somehow had to position itself within this global political climate. It also, Euro-American historians often assumed that their concerns were universal, and that what they thought was something that would concern everyone in terms of historical questions and political questions. The Cold War also influenced the funding of African studies, as I've already mentioned. While African institutions were struggling with the lack of funding, American institutions of higher learning poured money into African studies programs as part of their Cold War policies. And so the United States thereby were shifting the balance of power within the global politics of knowledge production about Africa to make it fit with particular US political requirements. And this created a decidedly unequal Africanist scene. So the general history of Africa then had to deal with problems of Euro-American perspectives and concerns being presented as universal and as threatening to push aside African perspectives, even if this happened without intent. And quite ironic, because negating this had in a way been the very reason that the project had come into being in 1964. Why then did so many Euro-American voices still interject? Well, that was also the result of the absence of African committee members. As time went on, more and more Euro-Americans showed up to meeting and less Africans showed up to meeting. And so Euro-Americans such as Jan van Sienaaf, but also Philip Curtin, moved into positions of greater influence and importance within the project as a result of institutional and material privilege, which they had and African committee members seemed to lack, consequence of global funding inequalities. And this issue of productivity, I think, is captured very well in a lecture given by the Ghanaian historian Adibo Hen in the 1980s to the Canadian African Studies Association. And he says, or writes, "It is absolutely true that the Dikes, the Babakus, the Ajais, the first academic historians, of which he was also a part, did not live up to expectations," he means in terms of publications and research. Because right from the beginning, they were saddled with such heavy administrative responsibilities that made it impossible for them to embark on any new original piece of research. Right? So material differences in circumstances were translated into a greater influence for Euro-Americans, and which itself perhaps created a sort of hierarchy of perceived importance regarding contributions of Africans vis-a-vis contributions of Euro-Americans. And of course, within this story of the general history of Africa, there are many things to say also about historiographical differences of opinion, ideological differences of opinion, but I wanted to focus on the practical and the financial, the political here, because I think it's still very relevant in our world today. It's not that long ago either. So to move on to my conclusions, I have presented a case study on the practice of decolonization to supplement theoretical reflections. And so I want to say that practical concerns and institutional dynamics, as well as geopolitical changes in power structures, influence the production of African history just as much as the development of theoretical frameworks. And I think, therefore, the analytical wall between studies of scholarly practice, right, between the history of science, the history of the humanities, and histories of Africa need to be broken down further in order to enrich both. And I have spent some time looking at the role of Euro-American researchers, but this could be done and should be done in much more detail in how they shaped the history of Africa or the history of African studies on a daily basis, and why they have remained so influential within the academic community that produces knowledge about Africa. So I think that the practice of decolonization should be studied in conjunction with a more thorough examination of the role of our countries, European countries, North American countries, and institutions in financing African studies within specific national contexts. So the context of decolonization matters greatly. And as I've started with, And decolonization takes place on different levels, epistemic, political, as well as economic. Like I said, of course, there were differences of opinion and subsequent contention that were all about the content and the actual history of Africa. But these were reinforced by problems of logistics. I think that it could be concluded to go with Francina that it is a small miracle and much more a testimony, specifically a testimony to the African historians who worked on the General History of Africa, their perseverance, that the project was brought into print at all, and that we can still read and hopefully enjoy it today. And I think I will end there. Thank you for listening to me for such a long time.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much. That was very, very interesting. I think you really, with this PhD, did something that we, or a lot of people who are doing sort of African history, are have been waiting for to read. And I think you might even, in a book setting, if you want to rework this into a book, might even make it even bigger and broader and sort of write a bigger history of African humanities from 45 to today, and why changes happened and how they happened. But I think, your choice for this UNESCO history is a great anchor to think about a lot of things much more broadly and widely, and it's incredibly interesting. I have a lot of questions, but I'm sure our audience has as well. If you want to ask questions, you can do this via the chat, or you can send us an email, which is decolonizationgroup@gmail.com. Or you can wave, if you open up your camera and wave to me, that is also an option. Yes, please.
I see some questions from Wouter in the chat. Should I? Yeah. That I really want to answer because they're great questions.
Yeah. Does Wouter want to ask them in person, these questions?
Yeah.
Sure. Great.
Oh, wait.
Hi.
Let's turn on the light. Yes. Hi. First of all, thank you for this great talk. How much more meta can you get than by doing a history about historians? So that is a wonderful new perspective. But I was also very interested in the context of the content of the work itself of the general history of Africa. And so that's what my questions were about. So first of all, the Arab conquests that happened around the 7th century onwards, are these considered an internal part of Africa, or are they an external influence like the European colonization project?
So that's a great question, because this was one of those internal debates that I referenced, right? Some people would say part of internal African history, and others would say an external influence. And there were this was a very tense discussion because it was very much about identity. I actually wrote an article which addresses this question, which I've emailed Frank, so maybe he can share it in the chat. But yeah, this was one of those very heated debates. Some of the general history of Africa historians were so sold to the idea that that African history needed to be written from within, that they did consider the Arab conquest as external, and others said that this was a sort of racialized vision of history that they wanted no part of. Right, so it very much depended on who you would ask, and in the end, I think they did include Arab history as integral part of African history. And they did conclude that the Arab conquests were a part of internal African history, and that it definitely wasn't the same as European colonialism. And this was partly to thank because the editor of the very last volume, Ali Mazrui, was a Muslim from Kenya, and that he himself thought that there were three parts of African identity. This is one of his most important theses, and he said African history is made up of three parts: the traditional religions, the traditional knowledge, which comes through oral historiography, the Islam and Islamic influence, and the Christian European influence. And he said these three things, this triple heritage, he called it, makes up what African history is today. Of course, one can debate about that as well, but he would very much argue that Arab history was part of African history. But again, many other historians did not agree with him or thought this was, in a way, detrimental to the point that they were trying to make. And so they wanted to emphasize more the internal trade, for instance, that was important in creating African societies.
Right, yeah. Because if he argues that European Christianity is a pillar of African identity, then what does that do with the idea about decolonizing African history? If European Christianity arrived through colonization.
Yeah, it didn't just arrive through colonization. That's, of course, that's good to remember that Christianity was very much a part of Africa before colonization.
Yes, but not through European.
No, exactly.
Not like the European version of Christianity. It was more like the Coptic and the Ethiopian Christianity, right?
Yeah, no, of course. Yeah, very good question again, and it's good to note that. And so I think this kind of shows that a big project like the General History of Africa is never just one. There's never just one opinion or one view of history or one historiographical theory, right? So Ali Mazrui said this, but I would say that a lot of the other historians didn't agree with him, and he was kind of an interesting figure within the General History Project because he created a lot of debate. He got a lot of people very angry with him. He was attacked a lot of the time for his points.
That means you're doing something right.
Yeah, mostly. Yeah, he would agree with that for sure. He became very anti-Reagan also later in life. He writes, he moves to America, becomes part of the American political commentariat also. It's a very fair question, but I think that Ali Mazrui would argue that one has to accept the fact that European history is part of African history and that these things are entangled, and that therefore, even if it is part of colonization, Christianity nowadays, and his book his volume was about the 20th century. In the 20th century, one cannot write the history of Africa without the history of Europe. But this was hard. I mean, this was hard to accept for some of the general history figures. And I would say that their vision of Africanizing African history by writing it from within, therefore does not necessarily live up to what we now consider decolonization to be. But at the same time, they circumvented such problems that you're highlighting by writing from within. So when they wrote the history of colonization, they wrote it from a perspective of resistance, right? They wrote chapters about resistance to colonization in all its myriad different forms: economic resistance, wars of resistance, and in decolonization and the history of decolonization, they wrote from the point of liberators, right? So that's a way to go around that. The history of Christianity in Africa, they wrote from a perspective that showed how African churches adapted Christianity to fit their own purposes and imbued it with African traditions also in different national contexts, of course. So yeah, but it's a very fair point.
All right. Well, and then my second question was about the that Europeans would consider pre-colonial African history to be non-existent.
Yeah.
That there was no history to speak of. And I wondered how they viewed ancient Egypt and the Kush kingdoms.
They very much claimed it as European, as white European civilization, believe it or not.
Wow.
So they claimed ancient Egypt as part of European antiquity, right? It was part of Greek, Roman antiquity.
Right, right.
Yeah. Yes. And so the general history.
And that way you can co-opt everything.
Exactly. So and that also kind of explains the anger stemming from the general history, right? Because it was up to them to reclaim ancient Egypt, and of course this whole debate about the racial origins of the ancient Egyptians stems from this kind of claiming of ancient Egypt as European, right? So that's a very big debate. Which, again, I wrote an article about it. But yes, they very much claimed ancient Egypt as European, stemming from the discovery of the Rosetta Stone by Napoleon in 1798, I think, or about thereabouts.
Something like that.
It's a very interesting history that is very much worth going into, because it does show how history is often a political tool.
Yeah, Napoleon's vacation to Egypt is a remarkable thing.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you for the question.
Well, thank you for these elaborate answers. You've given me a lot more to think about, and I hope Frank will send us those other articles.
Yeah, you can find the reference in the chat.
Great.
The link to the article. All right. I don't immediately see any other questions, so I'm gonna sort of try and formulate a question.
Well, Frank, I have a quick one, if you don't mind me leaping in, or maybe it's not quick. But Larissa, thank you, by the way, that was awesome. And I know this is public and being recorded, so I did tweet about it, and your thesis is open access, so I shared the link and things.
Thank you.
It reminds me, I just was listening earlier today, maybe you were too, to Frank Bierman and Carol Sennett, I think, who was here just a moment ago, thinking about academic extractive processes as a way of reflecting on our own positionality and how we might analyze the extractive labor or the labor extraction of European academia in relation to the global South. And also the gatekeeping. And I wonder if some of this occurred to you, do you write about that at all? What is your take? Did parallels occur to you as you were thinking about extractive mining, for example, and extractive history making?
I mean, that's a very interesting, very good question. I don't really have a clear-cut answer right away. There's certainly parallels within the general history. One person that comes to mind immediately is Philip Curtin, and the way that he moved through Africa in the 1950s, and the way, I don't know if you've seen or read or heard of his autobiography, but it's a very interesting source, I think, for this question, because he describes in detail how he travels through Africa with his wife, and how there are no borders at that time, or hardly any borders, because everything's still owned by Europeans, right? And that, I think, is a very good example of extractive labor, right? He goes to Africa for a year, drives through different places, interviews people, sees a lot of archives, gets a lot of material, moves back to America, writes lots of books about it. So I think that within my thesis is a very good example of the kind of extractive labor that you mention. And I think, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great. And actually, I was just sort of thinking of that. Maybe we can think of this as a conversation too, of the literary approach to travel narratives, and wondering if we could analyze, or maybe you do analyze Phil Curtin's kind of autobiography as a travel narrative in the same way that Mary Louise Pratt analyzes some of the early travel narratives. Yeah, and maybe also actually Black American men and women.
Yes,
and the role of gender and how many women were erased in this process too. And I think here of Leopold Senghor and his early encounters with the French women, the Nordholt sisters in Paris, who founded a salon that he attended all the time, fermented ideas with some of the other negritude authors, and never credited them. And later on in the 1960s was like, oh yeah, there were these women too. But also, so follow-up question, you mentioned the American dominance now of questions about Africa and how it shaped the volume. Again, thinking about some of the complexities of this, I'm reminded of a passage I saw in a Black American journal saying, if the Liberians only intermarried with us civilized Black Americans more, they would raise themselves up. And I saw this in a journal from the 1920s. And I was wondering about did Black Americans also have their own preoccupations? Were they more interested in the trade in enslaved humans than perhaps African historians were? And do you look at those complexities?
I mean, absolutely. Interestingly enough, though, the General History of Africa doesn't have any African-American authors contributing to it, which I think I don't really know why, to be perfectly honest. I haven't really cracked that nut yet. Walter Rodney did aim to contribute to it before he was assassinated, so he was a part of the General History of Africa. Of course, he's not an African-American, but diaspora author. Yes, yeah, I saw. It is, as Rachel says, my jaw literally just dropped. Now, it was very, very surprising to me as well, and I can't really explain yet why. So if anyone has any idea, please let me know. But I think it has something to do with this development going on in the United States. Yes, their own battles in the academy. Yes. So the fact that during this simultaneously or synchronously with the General History of Africa project being written, funding from historically Black colleges and universities seeped away towards northern white universities in the United States for the study of Africa, right? And you have Herskovich saying, I can't remember the year, but saying that America has no real historical connections to Africa at some point, right? So this whole revisionist Pan-African tradition that has existed in the United States since at least the middle of the 19th century is just completely erased for a long time from the history of African studies. So these things, African studies and African American studies in the American Academy, become completely separated, right? They can become completely separate endeavors, despite there being a Du Bois and that very rich tradition. And I think that is the best explanation I have come up with so far. But I think it merits more study and more analysis. And of course, within the African Association, the American Association of African Studies, there is the controversy of 1968. There are African American historians trying to get into that, but being ousted a little. They start their own organization. Philip Curtin again plays a very big role in this, and not necessarily on the right side of history, I would argue. He also plays a very big role in the general history of Africa, so I'm sure those things are connected. And yes, it would be great to do further research on this, but I think if I wanted to paint with very broad brushstrokes, I would say that the infusion of money as a result of Cold War positioning has a lot to do with it.
Okay, great. I mean, again, all surprising insights, right? Which I think, again, if you would think about turning this into a book, are all things that you could expand on and research further. Yeah, incredibly interesting. Other questions? I don't see anything in the chat at this point. If there isn't, I'm gonna try and ask a question, which is indeed the sort of this role of the Cold War. You sort of you also mentioned it in your conclusion, but I see like one line. I haven't read it in detail, but I'm just wondering. What is the role of the Cold War in this? Because you sort of seem to imply that the project sort of collapsed in the face of sort of Cold War pressures. I mean, is that the argument? And then, I mean, if it is, I don't really know if that, is that really what happened, right? Why refer to the Cold War in this history?
Well, I think there's two reasons. Firstly, what we just talked about, which is an indirect influence, which is that the geopolitics of the Cold War caused the American government to fund studies, not just African studies, but area studies across the line, which eventually creates a conglomeration of African studies experts in America, shifting the center of African studies towards America. So that's an indirect thing that I would link to the Cold War. And secondly, I think that the Cold War does destabilize countries on the African continent, which, and I guess this is also an indirect effect, which then leads to crises, which leads to the destabilization of these universities. Take, for instance, to take an example, is of course Zaire, right? Sorry, I got distracted by the chat. The university, which is first called Louvanium, right, which is part of the University of Leuven in Belgium, which then becomes nationalized, and which makes it, that university, it sounds a bit paradoxical perhaps, but the Zaireanization of that university eventually makes it impossible for historians to do their work there. Jan van Sina comments on this. He tries to teach there and then leaves again because he says it's impossible. There's just no money. It's completely politicized, the study of the humanities in general. And this kind of dynamic happens in multiple countries. And that's, of course, I argue it's part of the Cold War narrative, right? It's part of the Cold War history that certain countries become destabilized. Actually, I take part of that argument from something that you wrote in a book that you published very recently, right? That the destabilization of the African continent is not just the result of colonialism, but is connected to the Cold War as well. But maybe it's a bit too broad brushstrokes here. But I hope you get what I'm saying, that the Cold War does cause certain political crises in certain countries, which has an effect on how their universities function as well. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm just wondering if right, is it, if you maybe you overestimate the influence of the Cold War on this sort of trajectory. I'm just wondering, is there um, could you also distill from the different volumes sort of the stage that the liberation struggle is in, right? And this whole
Yes,
notion that
absolutely.
you can liberate Africa and decolonize Africa through culture is something that is incredibly dominant in the 50s, 60s. But then sort of this belief in culture as a way to liberation collapses in the 70s, which has to do, of course, with the limited results of the liberation project at that point in time, right? And
Hmm.
then people sort of shift and reshift. And I mean, does the project become less political as we move out of the 60s into the 70s and 80s?
Definitely. Yes, it loses its connect. So first, it loses its connection with Nkrumah, right?
Yeah.
He's very important in the first few years, but then leaves the scene entirely, and that's where. So from the late '60s, I would say, depolitization of the project definitely takes place. But contributors do complain a lot about the Cold War and about how it influences the way that certain contributors see the world, and which they don't think is an African perspective. So that's also one of the reasons that I would argue it does have an influence, if only in the imagination of certain of the authors, right? But yes, it absolutely, you can see the influence of politics. Not just dwindle, but also change. You can see that throughout the 70s, for instance, debates about Marxist methodology become more and more important. And part of the reason for that is that more meetings are organized on the other side of or on the eastern side of the Iron Curtain. There's a meeting in Poland, two actually, I think. And of course, a lot of Polish historians are attracted to attend that meeting, and debates about Marxist historiography ensue. At the same time, you have a change which takes place on the African continent itself. In Dar es Salaam, you have a school of history which increasingly becomes more and more Marxist. You have you have Walter Rodney joining the ranks of the ISC. So I'm not sure one should link that to the Cold War, but it's not absent either, right? It does play a role in how knowledge is shaped in that way. If you see what I mean, you can see it being referred to in discussions. You can see it being used as an excuse a lot of the time. So yes, you see politics changing. You see, especially in the last volume, which is published after the end of apartheid, which is published after the Rwandan genocide, but does not take them into account because it's written before that time. You can see that creates a lot of discussion and debate as well. So, of course, there's different political discussions that take place in different instances throughout the lifespan of this project.
Okay, great. Very interesting. Again, I think you've struck gold here a little bit, and I mean very keen if you want to sort of continue talking.
That's a terrible metaphor, Frank.
Sorry. But you know, everybody can strike gold if they want to. No, I don't
It's
know.
true.
It's not
It's
necessarily
true.
an exclusionary metaphor, but I'm gonna shut up now. Any other questions for what is, I mean, an incredibly interesting project? In the chat, or maybe just wave or just speak up.
Yeah, I see one more from Walter. I'm just, I have to hop off for personal reasons, but I just want to call people's attention. I won't go through them all, but there are some dates in the chat and also a link to our website where you can find exciting upcoming events. And Larissa, as I said, thanks. I've been tweeting excitedly about the talk, so I hope that's okay with you. And if not, ask me to take them down.
I think that'll be. I think we're good at that. And I did not read the entire series. I have to admit. I read a lot of it. I read the entirety of the last 3 volumes, I think, but some of the earlier volumes I've not read in their entirety. No, which is a bit, pains me to admit this, but it's true.
I think it's very human. Okay, Frank, I guess I'll leave you to formally farewell. Sorry, everybody, I gotta hop off. Thanks, Larissa.
Yes. All right. All right. I want to thank everybody for attending. For it was an incredibly interesting discussion. I encourage you to email Larissa if you have additional questions. I'm sure she is more than willing to and would be more than enthusiastic to talk more about this. I see Brooks Marmon here in the chat as well. All people who are sort of committed to writing histories of the African continent from really interesting perspectives. So I'm sure this is the beginning of a much more interesting conversation we're going to have. For now, I want to encourage everyone to check out our website. We have a lot of events planned for this academic year. We're still planning them because COVID and everything else, but we'll keep you posted. Check out our website and our Twitter feed. For now, I want to thank Larissa for giving her talk, which again was really interesting, and I want to thank everybody for attending and engaging in the discussion. So thank you so much, and see you next time for our next talk in the Unsettling seminar series.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. And I just wanted to say that if anyone wants to circumvent paywalls for my articles, if they want to read them, they can just email me.
All right. Great. All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.